Another prince of the Kakin Empire has died, or has he? The answer is both yes and no. As it turns out, being defeated in the succession contest may require both the body and the soul to be killed, meaning that our dead prince is still alive and well, and tonight is very potentially going to be the most bloodthirsty evening in the succession contest thus far. And very excitingly and terrifyingly, it looks like we're getting the Phantom Troop involved as well. But to start, we now have a working theory on the Zhangle coin mystery. We've more or less confirmed that the coins compound every 10 days. And I have to admit, I made a mistake when I was doing my original analysis of the coins. In that video, I said that Kaventiba's coin did not compound on the 10th day, but I was wrong. The first coin, the one in his possession, did change from a 1 to 10 on the 10th day. And this is a case where I just lost track of the timeline when I went back on it. But in my defense, Togashi jumps around a lot in time. Time is very malleable to him, very wibbly wobbly. Sometimes he conducts both flashbacks and flash forwards in the same chapter. For example, the end of this chapter with the Phantom Troop takes us all the way back to exactly where they were in chapter 400. So everything we've seen since then has been going back in time, and it's just now that we're all in sync. Back to Coinlands though, we also know that the coins reset if they are returned to Zhangle, or I guess if they change possession in general. But Kurapika describes this as an accumulative conjuration type ability, encouraging long-term possession of a coin, very counter to the nature of coin money circulating as currency. And Kurapika predicts that there will be a Nen awakening that occurs when the coin compounds itself to 10 to the power of 64. Now that exact terminology varies depending on which translation you read, but it's very important that we use that specifically, and I'll get to why in a bit. But it's said that it'll take half a year to reach this point, and there's a lot of nuance happening here that just doesn't quite make its way into English. To explain this, I'm going to reference Voracious Drake's translation of the chapter, which comes with notes for stuff like this. I usually find this incredibly helpful for my own understanding, and there'll be a link in the description if you're interested. But the way he describes it is how in English, when counting after you hit a certain point, you just give up on the naming system and make up a new word. For example, we have million, then billion, then trillion, and so on for a bit. However, after 10 to the power of 100, we give up, and that becomes a Google. And 10 to the power of 64 is the Japanese equivalent of this. This is the point where their kanji system says F it and just makes up a new word. And that word is fukushigi, which literally translates as both unthinkable and miraculous, and very much a way of saying that this number is so ridiculously big that, mate, we can't even be bothered anymore. So once it hits that point, a user's aura nodes are theoretically awakened and opened, and the coin bearer will now know Nen without having to undergo any of the training usually required, or the initiation, which is never ideal. However, there is a probable condition that the user needs to be loyal to Zhangle, and so this becomes a coercive manipulation type as well. I guess either slowly influencing you with Nen to favor Zhangle, which is a similar effect to what we saw with Salazar's Guardian Spirit Beast and also Six Prince Tyson's, or it will actively punish you for disloyalty, thus being coercive manipulation. It's not actually making you do the thing, but it is strongly suggesting that you should or else. And it could be a case that if you hit that number at the end of 6 months and you are not loyal to Zhangle, then who knows what it's going to be able to do with you after 6 months of aura accumulation. Is a lot. It's a very clever ability because if Zhangle wants to become king, he could even use these coins as loyalty markers, as in deliberately give them to someone whose loyalty he doubts and check up on them regularly to make sure that the numbers are going up until the day of judgment arrives. And in fact, that may be what Zhangle is doing right here by giving Kurapika a coin. There's no point in giving him a coin to awaken Nen because Kurapika already knows Nen. So I think that Zhangle is really starting to get his head in the game here. Although Kurapika also figures out that Kaventiba has a coin that he's hiding, which is brilliant, typical brilliance. And Kaventiba may very well prove to be our example of what happens to a disloyal coin bearer after a certain amount of time. Because at the moment, Kaventiba is 10 days ahead of Kurapika, so whatever effects happen to him probably give us a preview of what would happen to Kurapika if he continues to hold this coin. And remember, these coins do exude a very sinister aura, so I don't think that possessing one is necessarily a good thing, especially if you're loyal to a completely different prince, which both Kaventiba and Kurapika are. And there could also still be a whole ton of other scenarios under which the coins activate. And so Zhangle could be using Kurapika to just, have a bit of an experiment and see what happens. Because when the narrator was explaining Zhangle's Guardian Spirit Beast, it said that it had multiple abilities activated by multiple conditions. However, this next point cannot be understated because I always harp on and on about how extremely dangerous Morena's contagion ability is and how it could go on to represent a Chimera Ant scale threat. And Zhangle's ability, if this is accurate, is the same scale of threat just enacted a bit slower, but also a lot less riskier to implement. Because if he consistently gave out 1 coin a day for 2.5 years, then the Kakin Empire would then have more Nen users than the entirety of the Hunter Association. And that's only counting the coins. This isn't counting the fact that we would have hundreds of Nen users who can now initiate and or train other people to use Nen naturally. So in the grand scheme of things, it would take no time at all for the Kakin Empire to become the world's leading Nen superpower. And after 4 or 5, maybe 10 years, the Hunter Association would look like a complete joke to them. So Zhang Lei is an extremely dangerous prince to win this contest. But we've got to get there first, and it would be my bet that his guardian spirit beast hasn't left him completely defenseless, so the coins might have some utility for the contest itself. They're just primarily focused on looking forward like Zhang Lei himself. And we now have a very interesting decision for Kurapika to make as he tries to figure out the safest place to stash Wobble, because now that he and Zhang Lei have an alliance, the third prince's room is an option, but as it turns out, that safe place is not really anywhere. Their room is of course under siege due to the user of Silent Majority and any number of other threats that Kurapika has willingly invited into the room, as well as threats that have barged their way into the room via political power like Barbie Minor. But Kurapika also mentioned something very important to do with the Mafia dynamic. And this is something I hadn't thought of before, which is that the greatest beneficiary of the Mafia conflict is First Prince Benjamin, because the Mafia war would give him a very solid reason to enact martial law. And that theoretical Mafia war is not theoretical at all anymore, because unbeknownst to everyone on the upper tiers, it has already begun, which is again the trippy timeline we're working with. Everything we've seen in this batch of chapters happened prior to the Jiyu and Shah families officially declaring war on the Heoli family. So this condition for martial law is extremely close to being fulfilled, although Kurapika suspects that we would need the death of a prince, specifically Zhang Lei, Sradnik, or Luzerus, the 3 Mafia benefactors. And you know what? Just on that, Melody, Kaiser, and Contra Beast are planning to assassinate Luzerus tonight. And if that can be framed by Benjamin as a Mafia attack, then we've unfortunately given him everything he needs to take a huge advantage in this contest. That's provided that Benjamin even lives through the night, which is far from guaranteed because dude's got his own problems going on as we switch back to Hulkenberg. Before we get into the morbid and graphic stuff, this chapter gave me a solid shot of joy because we got to see Cheadle, chairman of the Hunter Association, and I love seeing Cheadle because wherever she goes, you can guarantee that our boy Leorio won't be too far behind, and here he is in all of his medical glory. Although this probably isn't the most amazing day for Leorio considering what happens next. And of course, Hulkenberg's Nen ability has become a degree more complicated because it's not as simple as a soul swap, a personality swap, consciousness swap, whatever you want to call it. It's trickier than what you're thinking. Because upon being struck with Hulkenberg's arrow, a random soul from the group that charged it, including Hulkenberg himself, is chosen and transferred into the target. Which firstly, wow, it wasn't actually Hulkenberg's plan to swap bodies with Might. I mean, it was, but it was one of 13 plans. This is just what happens by chance, a 1 in 13 chance that he has to account for every time he uses this ability, which is a condition that I really like. The random nature definitely makes this ability a lot less overpowered, much like how Kite uses randomness for crazy slots. So with Hulkenberg, there's an incredible amount of risk for the insane reward it provides, and after the soul swap takes place, only one body can be awake at any given time. So in this case, Hulkenberg and Might switch bodies, and if Hulkenberg fell asleep in Might's body, then Might would wake up in Hulkenberg's body and take priority until he falls asleep, after which point Hulkenberg would wake up in Might's body again. And it's explained that priority is given to Hulkenberg's side because a condition for the arrow is that Hulkenberg will die if he misses the shot. So if you wanted to make a less deadly version of this power, then what you could do, you'd either have to make the priority random or cede priority to the victim. But then we have the awkward situation of what happens when one body is dying, which it is. So in that case, the soul inhabiting that body will return to the original body, but the priority system is still in place, meaning that the two souls will sort of Jekyll and hide themselves and swap for control of the body. So after Hulkenberg's body dies, Might's soul will go back to Might's body and he will get priority, because again, that's the restriction, the whole death thing. Whoever is prepared to do the dying gets the priority, but Hulkenberg doesn't plan on that happening. What he's done is he's drugged Might's body to put him to sleep for about 10 hours so that Hulkenberg can enact the rest of his plan. And if Hulkenberg doesn't succeed within that time, then But speaking of drugs, I don't think this is specifically mentioned, but what it looks like is that Hulkenberg has actually used Mike's TSK-17 on his own body, which is such a boss move. Although I do wonder how Hulkenberg knew about it and how he seems to know the exact timing of all the effects. On an artistic note though, Togashi is the master of the macabre. He's gone out of his way to make Hulkenberg's death, the death of Hulkenberg's body. He's gone out of his way to kill this meat sack in what looks like one of the most horrific ways one could possibly die. Although on a merciful note, no one actually had to experience this because Mike's consciousness is asleep as Hulkenberg still has priority in his body. I really do think that the art in this batch of chapters has been seriously on point because Hunter x Hunter is, it's notoriously known for the shaky art, but these chapters have been flawless. Not just flawless, better than that, because every now and then Togashi will smack you in the face with something visceral like this, something that you don't often experience in shonen manga, and you can just tell that Togashi has spent a lot of a disturbing amount of time thinking about the horror that this would inflict on the human body. But the most genius part about using the TSK-17 is that it is going to 100% convince Benjamin that Might isn't being manipulated, because as it looks, everything went to plan. Benjamin is going to let his guard down, and I think there's a very real possibility that within the next 10 hours, Benjamin himself will be the next prince to actually die. Benjamin is feeling so confident in this that he's dropped all legal proceedings and even given Hulkenberg's guards freedom of movement again, which is wild. He's unknowingly releasing all of the pieces that Hulkenberg needs to potentially kill Benjamin. Although I do want to linger on a moment of humanity here, because Benjamin decides to honor Hulkenberg's last wishes even though they weren't written down, and he tells Mike to treat Hulkenberg's body, funeral, and all other proceedings with the utmost of care, which Hulkenberg even mentally thanks Benjamin for. It's a weird moment of genuine connection, because even though Benjamin has ordered this assassination, he's not celebrating it, he's not enjoying what's being done, and now that he believes that Hulkenberg is out of the contest, he's treating him with the utmost of genuine care and respect. And I know that probably seems meaningless after you just killed the dude, but this moment has humanized Benjamin so much to me, and it continues to convince me that, in desires for world domination aside, that he is nowhere near the worst candidate for king that we have in this contest. And I think it's going to make it that much more tragic if and when Hulkenberg then returns the favor. But then we have something very unusual for a Hunter x Hunter chapter. Pages without dialogue. What we have is a montage of all the surviving princes just going about their daily lives on the Black Whale 1. None of the panels themselves are particularly important, but they do two things. One is that this comes right before Hulkenberg's quote-unquote death. So these silent pages are almost like that classic scene in a drama where everyone's in the hospital waiting room in complete silence, knowing that at any minute their lives could change forever depending on how well an operation went. But I also see this a bit differently. When I see these pages, what I'm looking at is the calm before the storm. A brief moment of reprieve before all hell breaks loose tonight, as we've got at least 2 assassination attempts booked for this evening, and it's almost impossible to say who's even going to be alive to bring in the next day. Although I feel like I can say with quite a bit of confidence that Saradnik will be. He's also an exception for the montage. He's the only prince who gets dialogue during this section, lucky him. And honestly, we really do need a different video to completely dissect what's happening here because it's very not good. And it's continuing a dangerous trend that these past few chapters have been establishing. But back in Prince Worbel's room, Kurapika is preparing for Nen classes tomorrow morning, which I believe is where he plans on revealing the content of Fugetsu's letter to Queen Oito. Alright, so there's some confusion whenever I bring up the letters, because there are actually 2 letters sent to Worbel's room, one to Oito and one to Kurapika. And we don't know exactly what was in each letter and where they differ. But the big development here is that Camilla will be sending a representative, which she refused to do the first time around, likely because 1, she and her faction are already Nen users, 2, it sounds like a pretty big and obvious trap, and 3, 2 is confirmed because people did die during the class, and 4, 5, 6, however many other frankly very good reasons there were not to show up. But things are different this time because of the letter. Kurapika's offer to publicize secrets is much more enticing than learning Nen. That, or much more fear-inducing, as Camilla may believe that something she's done could be revealed. As far as we know, nothing about Camilla was included in any letter, but having one of her guards show up is bad news because it's likely going to be a have-not with the Yomotsu Hegui curse, and Camilla could very potentially be sending in the person dedicated to cursing Worbel to death. perhaps in a brazen attempt to stop Kurapika revealing anything. But this now takes us all the way back around to chapter 400. This was the final chapter of the previous batch 2 years ago, and the Phantom Troop segment ended with a ship-wide announcement, which has been one of the most insane cliffhangers that we've been pondering for the past 2 years, and it turns out that this announcement was the death of Hulkenberg. And it's very tricky to predict where we're going to go from here. My inclination would be to say that we're going to follow the Phantom Troop for a bit, because as an author, Togashi likes to use a very unique transitionary device, where the final segment of the current chapter effectively becomes the beginning of the next chapter, almost like the last page is what most mangaka would put as the first page of the next chapter. So we could be switching our attention back to the Phantom Troop and the Mafia War, which I would definitely not be complaining about. Tons of exciting stuff happening down there, although I don't know if we're going to be with them for very long, because Togashi has posted the completed manuscript for chapter 406 on Twitter, and we see what to me looks like a rather lavish room on tier 1 or tier 2. But just on that, we've also confirmed that chapter 407 is complete and ready to go, and I imagine that by the time we get to 407, a couple more are going to be finalized as well. And at the moment, Togashi has started work on chapter 423, so he's still working very steadily, which is not something that was happening at this point in the previous batch. So at the moment, I'd still be anticipating a break around chapter 410, but there is the potential that it goes beyond that, meaning that this right here is the single greatest time to be a Hunter x Hunter fan in the past decade.